to the Student Loan Planner Podcast. Today we are having a consultant takeover. It is all the ladies of SLP here to talk to you a little bit more about the survey and a little bit more about some things that women face when they are up against student loan debt and navigating life in general. Last week, we had Meagan and Travis talk a little bit about the survey overall. And so I want to start with Meagan just kind of giving us a summary of what was found in the survey, and then also a little bit about where we're heading today. So Meagan, take it away.
So last podcast episode, Travis and I had unpacked that survey that we had sent out. It was supposed to be an annual survey. We didn't have it March of 2020 because that's when COVID really hit us like a storm. So we did it again this past March, and now we're starting to unpack all of the findings. But why we're doing this, May is Mental Health Month. So this is something we wanted to talk about. And we know that the numbers part of planning, but there's also the behavioral and the emotional side of things. So we wanted to unpack those topics as well. But last podcast, we focused on some general stats, but we also really drove the point home that it looks like debt to income ratios matter a lot when it comes to feeling certain types of way about their loans. So anxiety, depression, suicidal ideations. It was very clear that one trend pointed to the fact that it didn't really matter if we were going towards forgiveness or if we had 6 figures of income. Those things didn't matter as much if we owed 2 times more than our income and our student loan balance. So that was interesting to talk through. Today, we really want to talk about a couple other statistics more in depth, and we want to focus on women. This is a women podcast episode today, so we're going to talk about all things as it pertains to women and some of these statistics specific to them. So let's kick it off with just talking through debt to income overall. So 40% of the respondents owe $200,000 or more, followed by 29% who owe $100,000 to $200,000. So many of the folks that are in our audience owe 6 figures, well over 6 figures. 41% of the respondents have income $50,000 to $100,000. 37% make $100K or more. Again, what's really interesting is 77% of respondents owe 1 or more times their income. And we found that those who, again, referring back to our last podcast episode, respondents who owed more than 2 times what they earned were 2.5 times actually, more likely to experience suicidal ideations compared to borrowers who owed less than their earnings.
You know, Meagan, one of the other things that I saw in the survey was that 65% of the respondents are female. And that kind of brings us to our point today of the podcast that, you know, we have a lot of women that are suffering with student loan debt, and not just a student loan debt, but suicidal ideation. So our survey found that 1 in 8 women who owe more than twice their income had suicidal ideation due to their student loans. Also, that single women earning less than $50,000, their suicidal ideation rose to 1 in 6 of the respondents. So not just is it student loan debt, but also earnings does impact that. And one of the things that stands out to me as I think about this is I feel like some women are drawn to lower paying jobs. So things like teaching and social work. You know, we have our newest consultant on and we haven't given her any space. Molly, what do you think? Do you think that women are drawn to some lower paying jobs, or what do you think is causing so many female respondents to be having suicidal ideation?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I certainly don't feel like I'm a mental health expert or necessarily an economist of any kind that knows these details, but I think what you're referring to through our research we've seen is what's called occupational segregation. The idea of, from when we were all little girls, are we better at art or are we better at math? Maybe we'd make great teachers because we played teacher and students growing up with our friends. Maybe we had tea parties. Maybe we had things that we didn't play business when we were little. So as far as, you know, are women drawn to lower incomes, the data basically suggests that women make 82 cents on the dollar of what men make. And without turning this into a total gender podcast, there's a reason for that. It's not just that we aren't paid as well. It seems to be that we tend to take those jobs that pay less. So things like being a teacher, hard to make 6 figures as a teacher. hard to make more than $50,000 as a teacher, but we have to get a master's to be a teacher. And so we end up with student loans that don't match the income level that we would hope for to pay that debt off. And so I think PSLF, or public service loan forgiveness, is really important in that scenario, but it's hard to understand PSLF, as we've talked about numerous times. So we don't want to speak for all women and say all women are drawn to lower paying, but just my personal experience on that when I went to get my MBA is that it was a mix. There were some women that wanted to go into really high paying marketing jobs, but the MBA that I got also had a master's of arts administration, which is a nonprofit master's. And so the point is, you are going in to get a master's to understand how an art museum works or a symphony works in order to run it more efficiently. And so for those that went in that path instead of the financial path or the marketing path that I chose, they're looking at 50 grand a year and looking at that for a long time. There's not the huge raises or bonuses that you see in other jobs. So I think it's certainly true that there is a gender pay gap. I think it's also that there's a bigger problem, sort of a systemic problem, that maybe women are pushed or are drawn to jobs that aren't going to pay as much, but we still have to take the same loans that people that will take higher paying jobs will have to take out.
And you can also almost imagine why people might be having that suicidal ideation when they feel like they're being penalized for doing something to help society, to help make the world a better place, when their work is so important. I know social workers in my life that have literally saved the lives of children that I've interacted with. Everybody has a favorite teacher that they can, kind of credit with something they've done really awesome to help make them the person that they are today. But then, like you said, you're having to go on in order to do these public services and take on this additional debt. And, already the lower wages is something you might be okay with or, understanding of because you're passionate about your work, but to be putting yourself in this financial hole could definitely make you feel pretty sad and depressed and feeling like you got the bad end of the stick. How do we kind of work through some of this? And what are some of the other things that we think of as it pertains to managing all this?
So also what happens when we've taken the job that we love, we've got a huge student loan balance, then maybe we meet a great person, decide to get married and have our first kid. Well, the US is sort of notorious for not having the best options as far as childcare goes. If we have a 6-figure loan balance, do we feel comfortable staying home with a kid and letting our spouse kind of handle our student loans for us? So there's more complexity that goes back to sort of those systemic issues of, do we have to go right back to work just because of our student loans? I mean, I think that can cause a lot of anxiety as well. If I'm in my 20s and I have a master's of some sort or a graduate degree, I need to pay these loans back. Do I feel like I need to push relationships? Do I need to push getting married? Do I need to push having children? The complication doesn't stop just as soon as we get out of graduate school.
We had a couple other questions to assess, what kinds of things could people be pushing aside because of their student loan debt? About 20% of respondents report being trapped in a job for their loans. And about 19% worry that they'll never be buying a house with student loans. And I know there are other statistics about delaying marriage or delaying starting a family because of student loans. And that is a reality. That's a huge reality these days. I wish I could go back and count them all up of my consults in the past of how many people have gotten on the phone and told me that they've delayed getting married or they've held on to this job because of their student loans. There's a large portion of people who feel in a way trapped by them because they don't know how to get out from under them without delaying things or without.
So Meagan, let me ask a question here because I'm probably going to butcher the details, but I listened to a consult with you a month or so ago, and there was a lady on the call who had student loans and she was trying to qualify for a mortgage and she thought she couldn't do it because even though she has 0 payments during this COVID forbearance, the mortgage company was assuming her payment was a lot higher than it would have been. So maybe we could talk through some examples of borrowers thinking about a home and thinking they don't have options.
We actually did a YouTube video on this recently. If you listen or watch our YouTube channel, But buying a home with student loans is definitely doable. There's just some obstacles or some things that you need to know. In this particular case, but in general, mortgage companies are changing the way that they're doing things on the underwriting side when it comes to federal student loans, or mainly federal student loans, because they have income driven plans where the student loan is still considered an installment loan on someone's credit, which means you're supposed to have a required payment. It's supposed to be paid off by a certain period of time. But we know with income, that's not as, we don't have an end date necessarily, because we don't know what our income driven payment will be 5 years from now if we're going to stay on that income driven plan. But in this example, it was interesting because this person had a zero, well, everybody right now technically has a $0 payment because we're in this COVID-19 period. And so she thought, oh, well, my payment is going to be very low to factor into this debt to income ratio, because mortgage lenders, they don't really look at your balance anymore when it comes to the underwriting process. Some do. There are some old school mortgage lenders that do, but a lot of mortgage lenders are coming around to factor the payment into that back end debt to income ratio instead of looking at the balance per se. So if we have an income driven payment based on our income or a proportion of our income, that could be advantageous. And this person thought, oh, I've got no payment, so this is going to be great. But the problem is there, when someone has a $0 payment, they want some kind of payment to be factored in. And they take 1% of the overall balance and pretend that is your monthly payment. So if you have 6 figures of student loan debt, that can be really expensive compared to what your actual payment would have been. So we talked through how to get over that hurdle. And it just came down to her getting a letter from her server explaining what her payment schedule was and her monthly payment was. And they can still do that during this 0% interest. I've had a couple other clients who have been successful with that, just obtaining that letter, giving that to the mortgage lender, and they can use that instead of the payment, the 1%, like arbitrary payment that they calculate. So some of these hurdles have a mathematical answer. Other hurdles don't. Well, I almost kind of think delaying marriage sort of has a mathematical answer in the sense of like student loans, because I'll hear all the time, well, we weren't getting married yet because we didn't know how it would affect our loans. And there are ways to make the loan plan work for a married couple versus staying single or having a spiritual marriage, which if you want to do that, perfectly fine. But I never want someone to feel like scared to get married because of their student loans. We just need to know how to pivot. So that's kind of both. There's a mathematical answer, but also there's other things that go into that.
I love the real life examples that, we're always able to come up with, and they're so applicable to things that we hear on our calls all the time. Molly, do you want to jump in with some of the other things that we've heard on our calls, maybe implications of student loans on various women, or some of the hard things that you've heard them discuss?
Some of the things that we've seen, and these actually might not just apply to women. These can, we've heard these from both genders on our calls, but maybe we're living at home with mom and dad longer because we can't even imagine getting an apartment or living out on our own, which has its own anxiety and depression implications, I'm sure. Not feeling free to look for the job that we actually want. So again, to go back to my story with my MBA, I kind of decided I'll go the finance route because I want to pay my loans off as quick as possible. Ended up in a job that I love and doing what I love. So it worked out. But when I was trying to decide between nonprofit and going down the finance route, it was the finance route because I wanted to pay my loans off as quickly as possible. So mine's sort of a micro story of that, but we hear that all the time of, well, but I think if I just stayed in this job working for the government or for this nonprofit, it's not really fulfilling me. I'd like to move forward, but I think I need to stay here because of public service loan forgiveness, right? Staying single for longer, we've talked about already. And then I don't know if there's examples of this, but and then insert your age here. I'm 26, I'm 34, and I can't believe I haven't gotten married, bought a house, met anybody. There's all kinds of experiences that people are delaying. I see my friends traveling. I see my friends buying a second home, or they're already on their 4th kid, and I can't even figure out how to get rid of this debt. So this is a real life-altering thing that I think when we all go into school, we have these promises of what we think we'll make when we get out of any kind of graduate school. We think that, based on the averages you see that are published, we're going to have this great career. And that's not necessarily the case. When you leave school and you get a job that doesn't pay as much, maybe you're a little embarrassed to report that back to the school. And so a lot of those averages that, you take 6 figures of debt because you assume that you basically you take X because you assume Y will be what you make when you get out isn't necessarily true. And that causes a lot of these implications of what do we need to delay in life because of our student loans.
Oh, I think you just brought up a really good point there. Is like no fault of the borrower. Sometimes people do their research. A lot of times people come to us and they say, I didn't know that I was taking on debt, or I didn't know that, XYZ thing was going to happen afterward. But sometimes people do everything they can to prepare themselves and still end up without the proper information. And one of those big pieces of information is, oh, by going to school, I am going to be eligible for a better salary. I don't know exactly what that salary is, but I did some research and they told me it's going to be XYZ, but those numbers have been kind of, the books have been cooked, if you will. I just saw something on something recently where they said that the average is not the actual mathematical term we should be using for things like this, but maybe using the mean.
The median.
Yeah, exactly. The mean or the median, to be able to look and see what it actually is more plausible for a salary based on what I'm going to school for and what people are earning when I get out of school. But that average number, you're going to have outliers, somebody who earned $1 million, and you're going to have somebody who earned, $0 because of various things. So that does lead people to feel very, very sad to get out of school. I see it with chiropractors frequently. They definitely think they're going to start their own practice and earn $200K. And, we've seen from our experience, chiropractors are around $65K on average of income. Student loan debt that they're coming to us with $200K of debt. So it's very different, and it's no fault of the borrowers, which could also lead to you feeling very sad and eventually even suicidal ideation. Meagan, what do you think about some of the things that you've heard or experienced, or the hardest or worst things that you've heard from your calls?
I was going to say, I wanted to piggyback off of your averages comment too. I do think we have to be very leery of averages. It can be a very misleading number. So talking about income, colleges will also list the average amount of debt that graduates will graduate with, how much student loans or aid folks graduate with. And these averages can be very misleading. And I wrote an article about this sometime over the pandemic, because we were talking about like how maybe COVID might change things with costs of attendance. But I put in this article a book that I was required to read probably in grade school. I think it was in statistics, but it was called How to Lie with Statistics. And it's really interesting about how really you can make any statistic or ratio or average skew in your favor, depending on what variables you include or exclude from it. So a very interesting book. If wanted a nerdy book to read, it explains how a person or an organization can manipulate numbers to make almost anything lean in favor of whatever message they're trying to convey. I wanted to find examples of this. I went to a local college here in Georgia where I live, and I was looking at how they recognized student debt, or how they were reporting graduates and how much they were graduating with student loan balances. So they did a study of public and private four-year colleges nationwide. And this university, based on 2015's numbers, had an average loan debt of about $25,000, while about 63% of students had some form of student debt. There was something wrong with this representation. It was using language that said out of all graduating students from 2015, the average student loan debt was about $25,000, but then goes on to clarify that only 63% of those graduating students actually had some form of student loan debt. So what I was wondering is, well, where's the average for those that actually graduated and had to borrow? Why are we looping in the other 37% of students who did not have to pay through student loans to fund their education? Because that is what's bringing that student loan debt average down. So instead of that student loan average being like 25,000, I wonder if it would have trended closer to 30 or 35. So that average debt load representation I found to be really misleading. And this was the first school I looked at for the example, and I found it right off the bat. So when we say that averages are really misleading, they're everywhere on these colleges' websites. We really have to be careful about what are the numbers telling us, because I know people make decisions based on income or based on how expensive the school is per se. So we have to be careful with what we're reading or taking from those numbers.
I was aware that, like you said, the books were being cooked in various ways, but to get such a flagrant example of it, as I'm listening to you, all I'm thinking about is that gap between the haves and the have-nots and how it further exacerbates the issue for those who have limited resources because they're trying to make a better life for their family. They're trying to, get ahead. They're looking at numbers and they're doing research, and little do they know, oh, I'm only going to have 25K of debt, and then they end up with 250K of debt because someone lumped in the numbers of the haves.
And I have a little something to add to that too. We've seen that. I haven't been on too many for-profit school calls, but I know that that's really true in the for-profit school space where you're told you're only going to need to borrow X, but then 4 years later, you're looking at 6 figures of debt where you didn't expect that. So it's not limited to any one type of school. I think this permeates all kinds of schools.
And there's a number of things that I think go into that. I think cost of inflation on tuition is outlandish. We've talked about that several times on this podcast. And so we're seeing one sticker price for 1 year when we have 4 years to go or 8 years to go, where we're not factoring in that 5 to 8% of inflation every single year on that cost of attendance. We're also not factoring in the change of what they're budgeting into the cost of attendance, because cost of attendance is made up of not just tuition, it's made up of fees, technology expenses, they factor in transportation, living expenses. So they can change, it's really interesting. They can dictate that number to whatever they want it to be. And I'm sure they have I would hope they have some methodology behind that budgeting for the standard of living in that area, but those are numbers that can change too, not just the tuition. So it's not just the tuition itself that could be increasing. It could be all the other fees and expenses that factor into cost of attendance.
Yeah, there's so many things that women and student loan borrowers in general are up against. I wanted to kind of transition back to some of the things that we've heard over time. And hardest part about having student loan debt, have you guys heard anybody kind of like list out some of the things that they're up against or the worst thing that they've encountered or the worst thing about having student loan debt as you talk to people?
I was going to say embarrassment and shame is a big one. We've seen, say you meet an incredible person and you want to get serious with that person. Revealing your debt is a big one. Letting somebody know that, oh, by the way, I owe 6 figures of debt. And are you sure you still want to marry me? It's something I lived through myself. Fortunately, my husband-to-be had 6 figures of debt as well. So he didn't get to say anything to me, but we had to navigate that together. You feel like a loser, even though you got this degree, you got this post-college or even undergrad degree to better your life. And then you're saddled with this debt. So you think to yourself, was this even worth it? Should I have just gone and gotten a job? And that was certainly something that I lived through. If we have 6 figures, 2 6-figure debts together, we have to get through that while our friends are buying houses and taking trips and having kids. We decided to pay ours off really quickly, not necessarily because at the time I didn't know that much about what my options were. And I think that's probably what a lot of those listening might be thinking of, well, no, I have to get rid of this before I can do something else. And, most of what we talk about on our calls is that's not the only option. The so-called fast and furious method of paying the debt off to just be done with it. That might be what's most important to you, but it's certainly not the only option. It's rarely the one that comes out of our calls, I would say.
Would you mind sharing with us, you said you paid it off really aggressively, like how much debt was it and how quickly did you get it paid off?
So we left grad school with $225,000 of loans, and that was for 2 MBAs. So we went to a really expensive school, a 2-year program, $225,000. Basically, my husband faced a couple of layoffs during that time. So again, back to the salary idea, I started with less than half of the salary that the school that I went to said you would have after grad school. So what it looks like for me, mine was 125 alone. The standard 10-year plan, which is what everybody gets placed on if you don't choose something else, was about $1,400 a month. So I had a job that was paying less than half of what my loan balance was. And I was expected to pay basically a rent payment to my student loans. Again, didn't know what to do. So I paid that. And then every time I got a bonus, every time I actually had a family member pass away during that time and left me a little bit of money, it wasn't a question. It wasn't, should I go on a great life experience for this? Should I put this into some sort of retirement account because I've been blessed with money left by somebody that's no longer here? No, it went to my student loans. There wasn't a question. So I think that fast and furious method is loans or else. There's nothing that you put the money, any extra money toward except for your loans. And that allowed us to be done in 6 years, which is really, really nice. But it delayed about us buying a house, no question. We didn't take big trips or anything fun that I think young people should take before they decide to start a family. And, you're supposed to feel good when you get a bonus because you've done good work. But mine was just great. Now I can knock off more of my loans. We've talked about a lot of negative things so far. And something that's a little fun, should you decide to go the fast and furious method, is that it became a little bit of a game as to how quickly we could both be done with our student loans. So I'll leave that in there for those people that want to be fast and furious. I mean, it's fun to overpay because then it'll be done faster. But there's certainly a lot of FOMO or fear of missing out if you decide to pay your loans off above all else.
So talking about like the really fast and furious route, I've had a couple cases where that was something that they absolutely wanted to do. They wanted to pay it off as soon as possible. They were committed to paying a lot towards their balance to get it knocked out. And more than a couple people have come back for follow-up consults a year or two later, and they got exhausted. And that sounded like a great plan from the get-go. But then I think maybe FOMO crept in. They realized that there were things that they were missing out on, that it's just exhausting to always feel like your dollars are committed to that student loan balance. That can make you feel really trapped. It's definitely important to applaud the folks that can do that, like you, Molly. I think that's amazing that you were able to knock it out in 6 years. That can work for some people. But for those that it's not going to work for, we also have to know that that's okay too. There's a plan that we can put together that's going to fit not just the mathematical answer, but the behavioral answer to your student loan situation. And it does come with having a plan that's going to work for you now and later. And another thing too, I think some of the negative or some of the intensity around paying debt off really aggressively may still come from really old debt advice or really old debt like feelings. And what we've been taught, if you have been taught this, or what you've probably heard in the media or in articles that you've read online or from certain talking heads in the financial industry, is that debt is bad and we have to pay it off like our hair is on fire. But the problem with that is debt is actually really inexpensive compared to what it used to be. So there are some older generational talking heads out there that are basing their advice off of interest rates and facts that are 20, 30 years old almost. So for example, mortgages used to be in double-digit interest rates. We used to easily see interest rates at 11 or 12% 30, 40 years ago. That is not the case today. We're seeing like 2.5%, 3%. Same thing with auto loans. It used to be double digits. And so borrowing used to be a lot more expensive. Student loans have actually hovered around the same average. There's been some years where there's been really big spikes or drops, but really we've been between this like 5 to 7% average for a long time with student loans. And the other thing we have to realize is that student loans are just a different bear. There is literally no other debt that you can pay a payment based off of your income or that you can pursue forgiveness on. There's nothing like that for credit cards or for your mortgage, So we also have to look at it a little bit differently because paying it off like our hair's on fire, that is definitely an option. And it could be the most effective route for someone or a class of folks. But if that's not the route, if that's not going to work for your lifestyle or mathematically, there are other options that we can pursue. But did you want to jump in, Molly?
Yeah. And my anecdote to that is we talked in the beginning of this podcast about single women and the increase in suicidal ideation based on making lower incomes. If I had not had a partner who geeks out about spreadsheets of exactly where all of our income and where all of our expenses are going and how quickly our loans would be finished, I had such a fundamental view or a really good view of what the end was going to be that I was able to do all of that. I think if I'd gone into a different field, not a financial field, if I hadn't gotten an MBA, maybe I got a master's in teaching and had gone to be an English teacher, it's really hard to understand all of this stuff. And so I had a partner egging me on and an exact view of when it was going to be done. And we had 2 incomes. So all of that together allowed that fast and furious. I think that, again, it's so important to know what to do about your loans. And hopefully that's what we're doing, is helping people figure out what their options are, because not all of us have an Excel nerd as our significant other.
I mean, I think that makes a great segue to, this doesn't have to be ending, life altering, putting you on a bad trajectory. You can easily change the trajectory by simply changing your mindset. And I think we should talk about, not just the obstacles that people face, but also the opportunities that exist when you have a clear plan, when you have a strategy, what's out there. So let's finish on a positive note, ladies.
Yes, please.
Yeah, if there's a woman out there that's listening right now who has had suicidal ideation, who feels like she doesn't know what to do with this student loan debt, is completely overwhelmed, resonates with some of the things that we said today, is just up against the wall. Maybe you borrowed at your mom and you borrowed Parent Plus loans for your kids, or you're that female physician that got pregnant during residency and was so busy you didn't have time to worry about your loans, and you just threw them in forbearance and didn't worry about PSLF. There's so many things that you could be up against. Postpartum depression is another one. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We've got to start by changing our mindset. We've got to start by getting educated. So let's talk about some of the good things we can do to finish this out.
One thing that comes to mind is, when you're looking at those around you that seem to be doing these really fun things, we have to remember the Instagram versus reality kind of world, where don't compare yourselves to others. If you're not buying a house right when you want to, I think this happens a lot with people that have long residencies. You see your friends who went straight into business out of undergrad, and here you have these loans and you're not really getting started until you're in your 30s. Try to be inspired by things rather than comparing yourself to people. For one, if we could all just be on our own path, then this would be an easy podcast and we could finish right here. But I think it's really hard in practice, the idea of comparison. But if we changed our mindset of, okay, here's what's right for me, and here are all the options on my loans. One of the calls that I was on was about a $300,000 debt, $300,000 to $400,000 debt. And just by being on the right payment plan, we saved $1,000 a month as far as payment goes. There's knowledge is really important. Knowing what your options are really important. So I think those are the 2 biggest things are, and I'm sure y'all have some to add, of try not to compare, because who knows, maybe somebody's parents put their down payment down on their house. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes? And then the second one is investigate, figure out what your options are with regard to these loans.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, Molly. The not comparing, someone might have heard, I asked you, to be transparent and share with us your numbers. And they're like, oh, you paid off all that debt in 6 years. And they made some assumptions about what your income was or what you did. And their situation is not yours. And they immediately made anger go that direction. But it's really about, when we change our mindset, like, wow, how cool is that? She is such a badass. I can't believe it. Oh my goodness. I am going to also, if she could pay off that much in 6 years, surely I can pay off my $60,000 balance in that year. So it's all about mindset and being able to recreate and change your trajectory so that you can go wherever you want to go. Maybe you don't even have, $100 and some odd dollars of debt. You're listening today. It's like, oh, I've only got $30,000 of student loan debt, but I also have a $200,000 mortgage. Well, if I do something similar to Molly, I can get some of my mortgage paid down, get rid of my PMI, and get rid of my student loan debt in those 6 years. It's not about comparing exactly to, this person's situation and then making assumptions about how theirs is better. It's about using that to inspire you to take some sort of action in your own life and create a cool plan for yourself. So I really, really love that. Meagan?
I just want to say, Lauryn, I love your enthusiasm. This podcast would have been a lot harder to get through if it weren't for your happiness and enthusiasm here. I love it. But I do want to hone in, and I think you said it, Molly, the power of education and the power of knowing your options and having a plan. I think almost every consult I've had, probably 95% of my consults, at the end of our call, we have a plan of action, what our next steps are. People will tell me, I can't believe how much weight is lifted off my shoulders. Even if it was someone who had an idea of what they wanted to do, but just needed confirmation, or someone, we have such a wide range of consults. And together, I was just looking at the numbers between the 3 ladies on the team for Student Loan Planner, we've consulted on almost 1,800 cases. We've seen wide ranges of where people are at with their student loans, from balances to income to life situations. The really obvious one, if I could boil it down to like one result, as far as all of those 1,800 or most of those 1,800 consults, the biggest, most positive result is just having a plan at the end of that call. If scheduling a call with us is a hurdle because of the cost, we have so many free resources on our website. We have blogs for literally any topic you can think about student loan related to help you navigate your specific situation. We also have it itemized or broken out by profession. So if you're a teacher, we have a whole blog section dedicated to you. If you're a physician, we have a whole physician section. If you're a social worker, it's really great to maybe look through those and see how can we build a plan on our own if we're not able to financially afford a consult at this time.
You brought up so many great points, Meagan, and you're exactly right. You don't have to invest the dollars if you can't actually afford it right now. And only you can answer that question. Is this worth investing in so that I can have peace of mind, so that I can have a clear plan, and so that I know exactly where I'm headed from a cost efficiency standpoint with information that's customized for me? We do this work because we're passionate about it. And that's the thing I love about being on the Student Loan Planner team. This podcast, even, you just click a button, you're on, you're listening. But if you want to invest the time to get a plan for yourself, we have given you all the resources on our website, on our podcast, on our YouTube channel to be able to do that. And we would love to just spend 60 minutes with you. Make sure, as student loan experts who are doing this all day, every day, like I said, 1,700 calls between the three of us, make sure that you have a plan. Molly, do you want to close us out?
We're all in a financial planning world, all three of us girls on the call. And so let's just talk about a practical way. We're specifically talking about if you can't afford the call right now, well, what do financial planners do? We plan for things. So if you decide that you want to spend a year going through all of the free resources, I don't even know if you could get through all of it if you read one or two articles every single day for the next year. And you could save a little money every month leading up to the call, because I think what all the resources get you is 95% of the way there. And then let us give you that extra 5%. Or maybe reading all the articles get you 80% sure of what your plan should be. But maybe you need some practical advice on how to actually implement that plan. Let us be the extra 20, 15, whatever percent to ensure that you're on the right path, because these are complex, but there's a lot of content out there. And I'm newer to the team, but I think it's certainly worth saving for the positive emotions and lessening of anxiety that I've heard on these calls is truly life-changing.
And with that, I think we leave you all. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have additional questions. You can find us at studentloanplanner.com. Thanks so much for listening to the show today. And you can find myself, Lauryn Williams, Molly, and Meagan, all by going to studentloanplanner.com and booking a consult if you want to speak to each of us directly.